I'd like to talk today primarily about Gandhari manuscripts and particularly a collection that we've been working on for some time that is now housed at the Islamabad Museum in Pakistan and preserving this unique Buddhist heritage. Just to give you a little bit of background to myself, Shri did mention, hang on a sec, let's just try and, there we go. So my undergraduate studies at the Australian National University, I studied Sanskrit and Prakrit and Pali and Tibetan and a little bit of Gandhari and Western philosophy, but I was particularly interested in texts, and for my honours thesis I translated a Sanskrit text, the Mahaparinirvana Sutra, which describes the last period of the Buddha's life as he wanders through North India and then dies, and the distribution of his relics. And this was based on manuscripts from Central Asia, from the Turfan region in Western China. So I actually traveled there after doing this project to look at the sites and, became very interested in Buddhist sites, and I'd visited those in North India as well. And that I then went to Cambridge and did my doctorate there, and I worked on the orality, the early orality of Buddhist texts. So, when you read early Buddhist texts, they're very peculiar. They have repetition, use of formulas, and things like this. And that I did a thesis on early Buddhist texts and how Buddhist communities created texts, transmitted them orally, a little bit like the early, Brahmanical texts, Hindu texts, the Vedas, and so on. And was investigating those texts as well. And that was published as Style and Function, the yellow book on the left. And that interest has really continued with a recent book. The composition transmission of early Buddhist texts. And this is, benefited from working now many years on these Gandhari manuscripts, which I'll be talking about. Comparing, a lot of it is, my job is comparing, say, the Gandhari version with the Pali, Sanskrit, and Chinese, and so on, and, trying to understand how Buddhists transmitted their texts, what was their attitude towards texts, and so on. So it's sort of a little bit like textual, archaeology. Now, the background to the project I'm going to talk about is heritage work. One of the first projects I worked on was this one, which is in the Kudado Pagoda in northern Myanmar or Burma. So in the late 19th century, 1860 to 68, the last king of Burma, King Mindon, had the whole of the Pali Canon carved on 729 marble slabs. So it's a 5-acre site, the biggest book in the world it's billed as. Now, it was the responsibility of good Buddhist Burmese kings to preserve the Dharma, the Buddhist teaching. And one of the ways they did that was to commission royal recensions of the canon in palm leaf. But his creation of this site with the whole of the Pali Canon carved on these marble slabs, you can see the one on the left, and they're each housed in little pagodas, was original. And we don't yet fully know where he got the idea from. But it's an amazing site. But when we visited quite early, it was in very bad condition, even though it was a UNESCO Heritage of the World, Memory of the World site. And, you had these gates were broken, there was whitewash on them, et cetera, et cetera. So we won a Japanese grant, had it as a project of about 4 of us working with the Department of Archaeology in Mandalay to actually clean and conserve them. So here's our conservator training local archaeology, Department of Archaeology people in conservation, cleaning this marble. And here's a clean stela. It's very beautiful script. So this is Pali language, so an ancient North Indian language in the Burmese script. And of course, all Southeast Asian scripts are derived from Brahmi originally, the Indian scripts. And then we've, mounted those images, making them publicly available. We're working with Burmese monks to produce a Roman transliteration of the Burmese script text, because not many people can read Burmese. And then we have digital resources whereby these can be displayed, and they'll be made publicly very soon. So that sort of gave me quite a bit of experience dealing with how do you set up a project like that and run it in a country like Burma, dealing with, government bodies, bureaucracies, getting things, done in those conditions and so on. So it's a wonderful place to work, Burma, and the Burmese were very interested in the project and, extremely engaged. But where I've been working more recently, probably for the last 20, 30 years, is on manuscripts that were discovered in Gandhara. Now, Gandhara, I presume most of you know, but I'll say anyway, which is it's Gandhara proper was centered on Peshawar, but Greater Gandhara is a larger region that incorporates eastern Afghanistan, up to Gilgit in the north, and what binds it is, architectural forms, art forms, and in the early period, the use of the Gandhari language. So it's a cultural region. And these new manuscript finds I'm going to talk about come from that area. And, it's sometimes referred to as the crossroads of Asia. It's all of the invading peoples, movements of people coming into the Indian subcontinent came through that area. And it's where, world civilizations meet, the Mediterranean, Central Asian, and the Indian, and, has produced some unique sort of cultural forms. So, it first comes into sort of European or, into history through, it was part of the Persian Empire, 600 to 400 BC. And then, Alexander the Great takes all of their territories from the Persians. And then, of course, he retreated. But you get Greek heritage there. So, in Iconium, in Bactria, you have, essentially a Greek city with, Greek statues, Heracles, you get Greek inscriptions, art forms, and so on. Or say in Barikot, which is in the Swat Valley in northern Pakistan, this is the most eastern archaeological site of Greek, built by the Greeks, the Indo-Greeks, defensive, and this whole strata there. It's a very beautiful place. Now, this is the Swat Valley. It also happens to be the birthplace of Panini, who I think you would know is the great Sanskrit grammarian of sort of 4th century, 5th century BC. So, it was a homeland of the, Brahmanical culture for many centuries as the Indo-Aryans came into India. Now, our understanding of the transmission, the implantation of Buddhism in that area is under the Mauryans, and particularly under Ashoka, 3rd century BC, where he is sending these Dharma Mahamatras and so on around his realm and distributing relics. And we get a site like this, which is the Dharmarajika Stupa in Taxila, Pakistan, which what you're seeing is not Mauryan, but the foundations are said to be Mauryan. This is a classic, Buddhist site where you have the stupa where visitors would do the pradakshina. You have little niches where iconic images would be housed, little subsidiary stupas where, senior monks would be buried, their ashes, and then the monastic complex, library, housing, kitchen, etc. Now, you get Ashoka's rock edicts you find there, and it's interesting that some of them are bilingual or trilingual though. So you have, some that are in the Gandhari. So Ashoka, his capital is in Pataliputra, which is modern Patna, and he is sending out his edicts around his territory, and that's in some form of Prakrit. And the scribes are transforming it into a Prakrit that would, they think would better suit the local location. Now, when it goes up to Gandhara, they are transposed or translated into the Gandhari language. It's very closely related to, it's a Prakrit language, so related to, Magadhan Prakrit, but the script is totally different. It goes from not like the most inscriptions of the Ashokan chord. Ashoka in the chord is Brahmi, goes from left to right, basis for all Indian scripts, and Kharoshthi goes from right to left. It's modeled on Aramaic script with a vestige of the the Persian Empire. But he also issues bilingual, so you get Greek Aramaic inscriptions, and that's Ashoka talking to remnants of the Persian and the Greeks kingdoms. So, it's really, after the, fall of the Marians, you have, the Greeks come back out of Bactria and form the Indo-Greek kingdoms, but it's really in the sort of 1st to 3rd century or a little bit earlier that Buddhism really becomes the major institutionally based religion in the region, particularly under the Kushans. As you know, they occupied North India up into Central Asia. And, Buddhism is witnessed there, and it came into sort of consciousness, of modern consciousness, of that it was once a major Buddhist land in the British colonial period, where the colonials went up into that area and find these, amazing Buddhist sites, Takti Bahi, and so on. And, this is a classic picture of the Archaeological Survey of India, 1896, basically pull out all the big bits and, put them on display and photograph them. But extraordinary finds of art, and that art, as I'll talk about, is very interesting. Images like this. Bamiyan, another important site. This is in Afghanistan, where you had the giant Buddhas until they were blown up. Was site of important paintings and so on. Was on the trade, one of the trade routes of a certain period. And it's a site of, as we'll see, of some of the new manuscript discoveries. But interesting, like some Buddhist lands, Buddhism, the stories that were associated with the Buddha that were originally set in the Gangetic lowlands, the place, the region where the Buddha, wandered and preached for 45 years, came to be set in Gandhara. The Gandharans maintained that, say when the Buddha tamed Apalala, a story that was actually set further down in the Gangetic plains and other sources, that it actually happened in Swat in Pakistan. And similarly, not just with his last life stories, but his Jataka stories, his past life stories, were also set in Gandhara. And this is, what you're doing, in effect, is expanding the Holy Land, to incorporate that. And, what a practice that was very common and favored in Gandhara is depositing or establishing relics of the Buddha in places that were not previously established. And many reliquaries have this formula, which is, such as this one in bold, which is, these are established, this person establishes these relics of the Lord, the Sakyan sage, that is the Buddha, in a secure, deep, and previously unestablished place. It was highly meritorious to do that. It was part of making that land Buddhist. And, relics are very rich, reliquaries and relics in Gandhara, like this one, the Senavarma, where you have little mini stupa in which there were relics, and then, precious, semi-precious things such as this inscription, and then little gold flowers and semi-precious objects. Also you have relics which are things used by the Buddha, right? So not just his physical relics, bones and so on, teeth, which were common, but also objects. So his bowl was, an object of veneration. And in fact, it was said that Kanishka, when he took some of the territories in the Gangetic Plains, brought the Buddha's bowl, which is a big stone bowl now, back up into Gandhara. And that object was seen by Chinese pilgrims like Fa Xian and so on, who came through that region in the 5th century of the Common Era onwards, and saw the way in which it was revered and so on. And there's the beautiful piece, actually. It's a newly discovered piece from Mezainak in Afghanistan. This is this copper mine that could be destroyed, and they're trying to save it. But it shows the pigments on it, which is fairly unusual. So there was also a practice in Gandhara and elsewhere of interring manuscripts in stupas. So, and we'll look at this one later. So that is this is called the Robert Senior Collection of Gandhari manuscripts. It was found in this pot, and on the pot it says that, in the year 12, month Avadunika, year 5, this was established by Rohana, son of Masumatra, in the stupa in honor of all beings. So, and this seems to be an anthology of texts that were commissioned by Rohana to be interred in the stupa, not to be read, as a meritorious act. And this is based, the power of this is based on a statement made by the Buddha that, whoever sees my teaching sees me, and who sees me sees my teaching. That is the Buddha's words, his teaching are the Buddha. And that could therefore be on a par with physical, relics like bones and things like that. Now, Gandhara was also important, as you may well know, in the shift from the aniconic representation of the Buddha, the representation of the Buddha through symbols like his feet, an empty chair with a tree over it, and so on, to the iconic. So Sanchi, which is where I met Shriya, is, this is an iconic, get representations of the Buddha there. Very beautiful place, the artwork extraordinary. But Gandhara played a major part in the shift to the adoption of representing the Buddha in human form, iconic form. And both Gandhara and Mathura said to be about the same time. There's been a long debate about which came first. And of course, there was a discussion of whether it happened in Gandhara due to inspiration from Greek models and so on. And I won't go into that, but it's it's a big topic. But what that did was, it freed artists to depict a much larger range, huge range of episodes from the Buddha's life. So whereas, say, in India proper, you might get 30, 40 episodes from the Buddha's life depicted in Buddhist art, in Gandhara, there are some 100 scenes or more of the Buddha's life depicted. So the Gandharans seem to be very interested in the life of the Buddha, and moving to the iconic really facilitated that. But also, the art forms there are really interesting, because there you have, this sort of basically Indian forms with this Greek Mediterranean overlay, like the robes, the contrapposta position, the hair, and so on. Or, things like this. You saw this is from Iconum, a Greek statue. And Heracles was, so the Buddha's attendant, Vajrapani, the one who has a Vajra lightning bolt in his hand, is attendant to the Buddha, is depicted in Gandhara in the form of Heracles, and this very masculine sort of figure. And you'll get, sometimes straight out, Greek forms depicted there, which adorned Buddhist monasteries, non-Buddhist in nature. Now, the language of the early period, so the language of that area was first recorded in the inscriptions of Ashoka, which I showed you. So that's 3rd century BC. And this language is called Gandhari. So it's closely related to other Prakrits like Pali. And it's a Middle Indo-Aryan language compared to, say, Sanskrit, which is an Old Indo-Aryan language. So closely related to Sanskrit and the other Prakrits, Pali. And it was used in that area, 3rd century BC to about the 3rd century of the Common Era, and in Bactria, northern Silk Route and southern Silk Route. And until these new manuscript finds I'm going to talk about, it was known through inscriptions, like on these reliquaries, through coins. So these are Indo-Greek coins where they have Greek on one side and Gandhari Kharoshthi, the script is called Kharoshthi, on the other side. And there was only one Buddhist literary document that we had, and this was found in the 19th century in Khotan, not in India, not in Gandhara proper, but in the Khotan's on the southern Silk Route in what is now China. And this was a beautiful manuscript of the Dhammapada. Part of it's in Paris, part in St. Petersburg. So that was the only Buddhist literary document for 100 years, right? So, of course, we knew about writing in Gandhara by images such as this, the Buddha learning to write at school, monks debating with scrolls. Here again, the Buddha writing, here the Buddha going off to school with, these writing boards. And also through ink pots from archaeological finds. These are displayed at Taxila Museum. So, we knew that writing was a major form, but we didn't have manuscripts for that. Now, this all changed in the early 1990s. So this first collection, it's called the British Library Collection, was the photograph on the bottom right was taken in Peshawar Bazaar, which is a bit of a clearinghouse for antiquities in northern Pakistan. And they were found in this pot, which has an inscription that says that the pot was the property of the Dharmaguptakas, a early school of Buddhism that has disappeared. So these manuscripts, they're birch bark, they're scroll format. The scroll is vertical, not horizontal. They were conserved at the British Library, and Richard Solomon headed this project. He's based at the University of Washington, and he dates them to the 1st century of the Common Era and thinks they come from Eastern Afghanistan, Hadda, right? So great diversity of texts, text types, some very early texts, Abhidharma texts, sutras, commentaries, stories, and so on. So I published one of the texts in this. This is, the scroll before it's reconstructed, just one of the sections of it. And this is the fully reconstructed scroll. It's about 70 centimeters long, and the original would have been a meter or so on. And this contains 3 short discourses of the Buddha, which are quite interesting. So second collection to appear is called the Robert Senior Collection. It was acquired by this coin collector, Robert Senior, and it's currently on loan to the University of Washington in Seattle. And it was again found in this pot. And this is the one I showed you before. It has this inscription which states that it was donated by Rohan, and it represents a sort of collection that he did for his benefit of his mother and father, and interred in a stupa. So it seems to be an anthology written of 41 texts as we have it, written by one scribe in a short period of time, and not written to be read, but to be interred in a stupa. And again, here's a birchbark scroll, folded in this case to put in the pot. And this is a conserved manuscript, conserved by the British Library, color image. And then we also take infrared images. And in this case, I've reconstructed the manuscript using an infrared image because it's a little bit clearer. And we end up reading and producing an edition of the text through, a combination of color, reading the color and infrared. And on one side, it's quite interesting. It depicts the story of Taposa and Balika, who were the 2 merchants who gave the Buddha his first meal. And this is sort of foundation story of several things, including the close connection between Buddhist communities and merchants. The other is the, hair and nail and so on, physical things as relics, and other points. So, you will have, say, this story is depicted on this Sikri Stupa in Pakistan, in Lahore Museum. Beautiful with, these 13 scenes, and it's the Lokapalas giving the bowl the Buddha each a bowl, and the Buddha doesn't need 4, so he doesn't want to refuse the deities the chance of gaining merit, so he collapses them into one. And that bowl supposedly is the bowl that was taken by Kanishka up to Gandhara and seen by the Chinese pilgrims. This collection also, so that has parallels in Buddhist Vinaya texts, and it contains many discourses, mostly connected with the what's called the connected discourse. That's the Samyutta Nikaya, Samyutta Agama, and this one here is, which I published both in regular form and digital form, Um, the Pali is called the Natalakkhana Sutta, Discourse on the Characteristic of Not Self. And it's quite an interesting text, one of the core Buddhist texts. Another major manuscript collection turned up in Bamiyan. So supposedly was found in these caves. A wall fell down or was broken down, and this huge cache of manuscripts that span some 700 years of literary history of that region, which includes the earlier one, Gandhari Kharoshthi. This is something that Richard Solomon and I published. And then you get Sanskrit Brahmi manuscripts, such as this Lotus Sutra. So, huge diversity of texts spanning a large period of time. These ones also went off onto the antiquities market, and some are in Norway in collections, some in Japan, and so on. So, very unfortunate, but that's the story for virtually all of these collections. Yet another collection, Bajau collection. The story is that it was found in Bajau. It's the province northern Pakistan, borders Afghanistan, and contains 19 birchbark scrolls, 22 texts by different scribes. And again, it incorporates a diversity of genres, of text types, some early texts, one Mahayana text, and so on. It's the project to publish this is headed by Ingo Strauch at the University of Lausanne in Switzerland. And then you have split collection, just 5 manuscripts, again, went through the antiquities market, acquired by somebody in Europe, and then they were made available to Harry Falk to publish. Perfection of Wisdom text on the left. This is the earliest Indic manuscript of this important class of Mahayana literature, so very early. And then a Dhammapada, which is quite a famous Buddhist text, and other things as well. Then also Gilgit, which is northern Pakistan, was the site of the discovery of a large collection of Sanskrit manuscripts, which date to 7th, 8th century in the 1930s. And this was, of course, pre-independence of India and Pakistan. Some are in Karachi, some are in Delhi, and some are elsewhere. And this was a collection that was discovered there more recently, and then went on to the antiquities market and is now in a private collection in Virginia in America, and in some collections in Japan. So it includes a substantial portion of what are called the long discourses, Digagam of the Buddhist canon, some Vinaya monks' training rules, and so on. And then you actually get a small quantity of Bactrian. Now, Bactrian is an Iranian language, but they use Greek script. And again, this is in private hands, so probably found in northern Afghanistan, then smuggled out of the country, right? So, before the discovery of these Gandhari and Sanskrit manuscripts, the examples of Buddhist literature from Gandhara were virtually non-existent, right? And our knowledge was based on archaeological sites, art objects, accounts of Chinese pilgrims, coins, and inscriptions. But, around the 1990s, these numerous collections, significant collections of Buddhist manuscripts in these languages started appearing. And, these is really significant. We're at the beginning of publishing, editing these materials, but, they're highly significant to a number of areas, to understanding the, say, history of the region of Gandhara, and then particularly the Buddhist history, what schools and form of Buddhism were present in the region. So of the early schools, the only one survives is the Theravada tradition of a school of Sri Lanka, Burma, Thailand, etc. All the others died out. Now, say, of one of the early schools, the Dharmaguptakas, we only had remnants of their literature preserved in Chinese translation, 3 or 4 texts, and then a few Sanskrit fragments from Central Asia. So, at least 2 of these new collections clearly belong to this school. So we're recovering this school and its part of its literature, at least, through these new manuscript finds. They're also important for the rise of Mahayana, because there's amongst them the oldest Mahayana manuscripts we have. Witness developments in Buddhist thought practice, the nature of texts used by Buddhist communities at different periods, what were they reading, what did they consider important, development of Buddhist literature, and then of Buddhist canons, and then, of course, study the Gandhari language and script. Now, before the recent discovery of these manuscripts, there wasn't, even though we had inscriptions and one manuscript and so on, there was no dictionary of this language and no grammar. So, that shows you how new this field is. And suddenly with this, massive corpus of manuscripts, texts in this language, we are producing, members of our community producing dictionaries and grammars. And it's also important to understand the spread of Buddhism, because this region was the region through which Buddhism was transmitted from India up into Central Asia and then onto China and the rest of East Asia. And then also very important for understanding Buddhism in South Asia more generally, in North India and elsewhere. And then we know that Chinese translations, a big corpus of Chinese texts, were made from Indian originals. It was often thought that they were originally all in Sanskrit, but in fact, it appears that they were made based on various features, were made from Gandhari originals. So here we have Gandhari corpus that we can assess better these Chinese translations. And then art historical research. So before these discovery of these manuscripts, there was no local literature upon which art historians could interpret Gandharan art, which is extremely rich. So that's the background to what I'm going to talk about, which is the Islamabad Museum collection. So, some years ago, our small community, myself, Richard Solomon, Seattle, and so on, learned of a collection that was in Pakistan and was sort of the owners wanting to sell it and leave the country. So I and this small community of scholars worked to raise funding to purchase it, to donate to the Islamabad Museum to keep it in Pakistan. So with the help of Buddhist donors, this was this collection of many years. It took a lot of work for this to work with, and I worked with the Australian High Commission in Pakistan, the Pakistan High Commission in Australia, the Department of Archaeology and Museum in Pakistan, and so on, to put together agreement for the housing of this collection at that museum, and for our team to work on publishing these manuscripts, to conserve them and publish them. Now, as I said at the beginning of this talk, I'm really a textual scholar. I'm interested in how Buddhist communities compose texts, the nature of the text, how they're transmitted over time. And, these manuscripts are very important for that area, along with many other things. But, to read these manuscripts, we need to conserve them because they're mostly unconserved. To conserve them, we had to build at the Islamabad Museum a conservation room. Actually, sorry, I'm just running ahead of myself. So just backtrack a bit. So we signed this agreement. This collection, very, again, great diversity of texts, but it appears to be the largest collection so far of Buddhist texts in the Gandhari language Kharosthi script. The date is, like all these manuscripts, is probably 1st century BC to the 3rd century of the Common Era. So like these other Gandhari ones, not the Sanskrit ones, the Gandhari ones, these represent the oldest Buddhist and oldest South Asian, oldest Indian manuscripts so far, right? Most manuscripts in India, South Asia, Southeast Asia also don't last very long. There's, creatures that want to eat them, the tropical climate's very hostile to them. So these are extraordinary finds. So, within this collection, we have texts that witness some of the earliest strata of Buddhist literature, such as this one, what's called the Book of Eights or Collection of Eights within the Sutta Nipata, within the canon, metrical verse texts, discourses of the Buddha. This one here, which is one of the first examples of what's called the Pratimoksha. So the Pratimoksha are the rules. So say the Theravada tradition of Sri Lanka has 227 rules for monks of how they should behave, and what are the rules and what are the consequences of contravening those, or undertaking actions that are contrary to the Buddhist orientation. So these are the some interesting substantial portion of what are called the Sanghadisesha rules, and these are interesting because we only have most Pratimoksha and Vinaya discipline, that's monks, monastics, disciplinary texts were much later, and it was thought that they were conserved and transmitted orally. But here's very early manuscript witnesses to them. Similarly, we're getting in this new collection quite a few Mahayana texts. So these are the earliest Indic witnesses to these Mahayana texts, with which we can compare the much later, say, Chinese translations, or the even later Sanskrit versions preserved in Nepal and elsewhere. This is an interesting text I published, which it's very fragmentary, but what it contains is pretty important, which is it records the gift, either the items bought with money donated by Vimakadphises, the father of the great Kanishka, so one of the great Kushan kings, or the actual objects he donated and their value. And this is the first Buddhist monastic ledger, which must have been very common. Monasteries must have kept records of who gave them what, and so on. And here we have this first example of a monastic ledger, and a monastic ledger in Gandhari. And it's also important because Vimakadphises was not recorded as being a supporter of Buddhism. His coins showed, sort of Shiva-type images, or Wes actually, and also important for dating. And here we have record of a great Kushan king being a patron to a Buddhist monastery. Now, this doesn't mean he was Buddhist, but what it tells us is that because good Indian kings supported the major religions of their realm, like Ashoka. And so, very important manuscript. Now, the former owner of this collection had conserved these manuscripts between plastic, either hard plastic or soft plastic, heat sealed, which was really tragic. But we will have to reconserve those manuscripts. And then there's 38 or more these are unconserved scroll fragments. This one's quite interesting. It's bilingual. It's got Sanskrit on one side in Kushan Brahmi, on the other side is Gandhari Kharoshthi. So this is the Islamabad Museum, and this is a conservation space that was recently built by the Koreans. So the Korean government basically shipped in a huge container full of conservation material and set up this state-of-the-art conservation lab. However, this is for non-organic materials, so stone, metal, etc., and pottery. And so we had to actually build a paper conservation laboratory to conserve manuscripts. So that's we raised funding for this, the conservation imaging, and we were allocated a space in the museum. That's what it looked like, and it was in very poor condition. So December last year to sort of March, we basically oversaw the building of this space at the museum. So going back to what I started to say and realized I was sort of out of place, which was I'm interested in these texts. To read the texts, I need to conserve them. To conserve them, I need to build a conservation space, right? Or we need to build a conservation space. So, we then went to the museum, and the woman in the background there is a conservator. She's Portuguese, and we did an assessment of the collection. She did, looking at, what is the condition of each manuscript, and what would it take to conserve it? What sort of time, resources? This is the fully completed conservation room. We're still in the process of completing the tables at that point, but these are the two conservators. So Bunny Assis, Portuguese, Mary French, she's from the Boston Public Library. I chose them because they both had experience in conserving birch bark manuscripts. So that's extremely important, both very skilled conservators. So in July this year, we worked for 3 weeks there conserving manuscripts, and it was very productive. So you can see, basically you're unrolling these manuscripts, conserving them between class, storing them. This is temporary storage until we build proper conservation ones. So this cabinet was loaned to us by the Koreans there, and that's where the manuscripts are currently being kept. So I just want to show you something which is, oops.
Oh yeah, actually, because it seems like that's loose.
Yeah, I think we did.
Oh, this might be too.
Can you see that okay?
Yes, we can indeed.
Yep. So this is the conservation of birch bark scroll, right? Very rewarding to watch, very skilled work, two conservators working together, by far the best. Basically, the method is you build a humidity chamber, you expose, you have and there's very special materials like, the bottom layer of the chamber is high quality paper, blotting paper. Then you have Sympatex and Bondina, and you put moisture into the blotting paper. You rest the scroll on the Bondina, and seal the chamber, and basically leave for 3 days, something like that. So, and then the scroll, these are 2,000 years old, are absorbing the moisture and becoming supple. And, then that gives you opportunity to start unrolling them. You can see how they are unrolling them. And then when they unroll a section, they'll put a microscope file on slide to weigh it down temporarily. So let me just go back to my display. Can you see my screen again? Actually, that's...
Yes, we can.
Sorry, I just need to go back to where I was. Okay, back here. So that's the, conservation of the manuscript. Very skilled work, laborious on some levels, but very rewarding. So, to watch these, ancient documents being unraveled, and then, as they were unraveling them, once they're conserved, I would take images. You can see here, there's a large A3 scanner that I actually took with me in my luggage from Australia, and produce high quality images, which we will use. To be reading these manuscripts, first time in 2,000 years, it's very rewarding and interesting. So now what we're doing at the museum is, we didn't do it this time because it was the first time we started conserving, but the next time we go, we will actually conduct a manuscript conservation workshop. So there's currently no one in Pakistan and they have very few paper conservators who can conserve this sort of material. So we will build capacity by running a Gandhari workshop and training them as we're conserving manuscripts. Similarly, sort of in conjunction with this, is that there's also no one in Pakistan who can do what I do with this history. That is, has the language skills, knowledge of Buddhist literature and history and so on. Now, there's very good archaeologists, very good art historians in Pakistan, but they don't have the language skills. So one of my colleagues, Jason Ellis, who I've worked on this project for a long time, he's from Canada, works on the Upper Indus. They're building a dam there, so his team is documenting these pilgrim or traveller merchant inscriptions of that area. he and I have been in conversation with people at Qaid University in Islamabad and then Punjab University in Lahore to develop Gandhari and Sanskrit programs. So it's a long project to train, young scholars in how to work with this material and inscriptions and so on. Now, this laboratory, right, this conservation lab, will act then as a place where similar manuscript finds, and there's undoubtedly going to be some, and hopefully kept in the country, can be conserved. So the Department of Archaeology Museum, Islamabad Museum, is the federal archaeological body, and anything that is seized at a border or repatriated comes to them. So this image on the left is a collection of Bactrian manuscripts, so they must have come from northern Afghanistan, that were seized at the border, and they obviously need conserving. This is here, these are Sanskrit manuscripts which are known just by their script and other features to come from Gilgit, that's northern Pakistan, and they were in the collection of the manuscript collector in Norway, Martin Skoyen, and he was repatriated and was forced to repatriate them. So they also need conserving. So that conservation space we build and the capacity, hopefully with Pakistani conservators, will enable Pakistan to conserve and their heritage. Similarly, recently, two Pakistani archaeologists learnt of these are Sanskrit texts, mostly secular Sharada scripts, so that's 6th century, that were found in the Punjab, and that's pretty unusual. It was thought that Punjab would be too humid, but here you see this bit of wad of a manuscript, and they were appearing on the antiquities market, and they learnt about it, put a stop to it, and basically have started excavating themselves. So these manuscripts themselves will also be needing conserving. So I don't really have time. I mean, if you want me to, I can, but we've been developing sort of digital resources for digitally publishing and disseminating this material. So, scholarly publications, not widely available, particularly to people in the regions from which this material comes. So, we have, what Story Maps is. It's a, form in which you can have a web-based story about a particular topic. We've produced one for Gandharan manuscripts, and we aim to have this and other resources, select manuscripts, translations translated into Urdu and Pashto, so that people of that region can actually learn more about their heritage. These are scholarly tools that we have mainly aimed at scholars, where they're good pedagogical tools. There's a close link between each letter and the actual letters and words in the edition. We can produce glossaries and so on and so on. And then finally, we've extended that to art objects, whereby we've segmented sections of an art object, and the robe, the ushnisha, urna, etc., so that again, a good pedagogical tool, but also you run that across a big corpus of things you could draw up. Well, give me all examples of the Buddha's, ushnisha or urna in Gandhara, or his robes, or this mudra, and so on. What does this do? This Gandhari manuscript project is that by housing these at the Islamabad Museum and in Pakistan, this sets a precedent for the reversal of the common scenario whereby such material is taken out of the region of origin and usually as part of the antiquities trades, and which results in a significant loss of cultural heritage to Pakistan and Afghanistan. And that would form, I hope, the basis for repatriation of Pakistan manuscripts that have been taken out of the country. And you saw how numerous that is. And it will also form the basis of collaborating with Pakistani scholars for training students, particularly in conservation, then of being able to read this material. Just finally, then, if you are particularly interested in this field, that is, Buddhist Literature of Ancient Gandhara. This book, this is Richard Solomon, based at the University of Washington, published not long ago. And it's a very good introduction to the field, what I've been talking about today. Plus, it's essentially a selection of English translations of these manuscripts. So very useful. So I'll stop sharing now.